Greetings, everyone. Do you think other people are necessary for our spiritual development to develop? If so, who then helps us develop our spiritual life? Welcome to my podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture. My name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist who integrates my training in psychology and scripture studies to help understand the Gospels from a different perspective and focus on new pastoral teachings for Christians. The Gospels provide us with a rich source of learning about God and developing our spirituality. We are far from exhausting the learning potential. My podcasts are between 7 to 10 minutes in length, where I share the insights and reflections that I hope will be useful to you. Please don't hesitate to contact me with questions or comments. Love to hear from you. Before I go any further, I hope that you were able to access my podcast on the spirituality of New Year's resolutions. Every season of Advent and Lent, I try to do an extra podcast for their season. And Advent, being a time of preparation, seemed like an appropriate time for us to prepare for New Year's resolutions. I invite you to listen to it. I hope it'll be useful to you. Today's podcast is from Luke chapter 1, verse 39 to 45. This gospel will be read in churches December the 22nd, 2024. In today's podcast, we have Mary visiting her cousin Elizabeth. There are several points in the gospel which I want to point out. We have Mary, who is pregnant herself, going to help her cousin Elizabeth, who is also pregnant. Mary's sense of service is obvious. We have Elizabeth recognizing Mary as the mother of God. We don't know much about Elizabeth. What we hear today is actually a quote that Luke uses from the Song of Hannah, which is found in 1 Samuel, verse 1 to 2 and 19 to 20. In the whole gospel, the only line that we can be confident that she spoke about was from Luke chapter 1, verse 60, where she insists when her relatives try to pressure her into naming her son after his father. Elizabeth responds, "No, he is to be called John." I'll talk more about that later. We know that Elizabeth was likely past childbearing years. She was not able to have a child in a culture that expected women to have children. Many people looked down on women who were childless. Elizabeth is not the only one from the Bible who struggled with infertility. Sarah was initially barren and well past childbearing age when she gave birth to Isaac. God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. Because of their old age, Sarah laughed at the prophecy, but ultimately she bore the child Isaac, fulfilling God's promise. We see that in Genesis chapter 11, verse 30, and chapter 21, verse 1 to 3. 1 to 3. Isaac prayed for Rebekah because she was barren. God answered his prayer, and she conceived twins, Jacob and Esau, after being childless for 20 years. Genesis chapter 25, verse 21. Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, struggled with barrenness, while her sister, Leah, also married to Jacob, bore many children for him. God remembered Rachel and enabled her to conceive Joseph and later Benjamin. Genesis chapter 30, verse 22 to 24. As I mentioned earlier, Hannah was deeply distressed over her inability to have children. After fervent prayer at the temple, God granted her a son, Samuel, whom she dedicated to the Lord's service. We see this in 1 Samuel, verse 1 to 2 and 19 to 20. The wife of Manoah was visited by an angel who announced that she would conceive Samson despite her barrenness. The child was destined to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Check out Judges chapter 13, verse 2 to 5 for their full story. These narratives collectively illustrate God's ability to intervene in seemingly impossible situations, providing hope and encouragement to those facing similar struggles with infertility or barrenness. Except for that one time, we don't hear much about Elizabeth. She is one of the unsung heroes of the Gospels. Today's Gospel indicates God working behind the scenes, before the mission even started. Elizabeth has only one line in Scripture. After the naming of her son, she finds her voice and states that her child will be called John. Her husband, Zachariah, who cannot speak, so Elizabeth has to speak on his behalf. Luke chapter 1, verse 59 to 63. The phrase, "Blessed are the meek," originates from Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, where it is part of the Beatitudes spoken by Jesus during the Sermon on the Mount. I have often reflected on what Jesus meant by meek. Up to this point, I thought meek was synonymous with being timid and humble. But as I prepared for this podcast, I realized that meekness means so much more than that. Elizabeth is an excellent example of being meek. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know much about Elizabeth, but I suspect she had her struggles. Being considered barren must have been hard on her. Every month, she would be reminded that she could not have children. Every time she saw a child, her heart would ache. Even today, the stories of childless couples trying to have a child can be heartbreaking. Elizabeth handled herself well and remained faithful to God, despite the fact that it would appear God was not answering her prayers. Her faithfulness under pressure is admirable. She is truly an example of what meekness is all about. She is strong. She can and does speak her truth confidently and succinctly when the time comes. These two women, both pregnant, however, their lives are different. Mary was just beginning her life. She was likely poor and full of hope for the future. Elizabeth, being married to Zachariah, a high priest, was likely considered upper class. Her initial inability to have children was probably painful for her, especially in a culture that placed a high value on having children. She likely experienced the sting of being pitied by her friends and discounted by strangers. Yet she remains faithful. We know the angel Gabriel went to Mary to ask her to be the mother of Jesus. The same angel, Gabriel, went not to Elizabeth, but to her husband, Zachariah, for his permission. Because of his unbelief, he is made to be mute. One could sympathize with Elizabeth. Who could blame her if she got angry or was bitter because of the injustices she experienced? She provides us with a role model for Christians who have been marginalized by society. I'm reminded of the Serenity Prayer, written by Reinhold Niebuhr, who was believed to have been the first used it in a sermon in 1943. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Elizabeth lived that prayer almost 2,000 years before it was written. Elizabeth and Mary teach us much about meekness and spirituality. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me next week when I examine the Gospel of Luke, who describes the infant Jesus being presented in the temple and the miraculous prophecies that would describe the mission of Jesus. If this is the first time you've heard my podcast and you are interested in hearing more, I urge you to listen to my podcast listed on the website. Every Sunday, I release a new podcast focusing on the gospel for the following week. I invite you to listen to all the podcasts, and I hope the reflections are useful to you. The podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture, is found in most of the platforms that carry podcasts. The podcast is also available on YouTube. Please do not hesitate to subscribe and leave a review. Feedback from my listeners can be helpful in the development of the podcast, and answering your questions is important to me. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank my team, Heather Patel-Doherty and Richard Coulombe, who play an important part in the preparation for this podcast. If you have any questions or concerns, I can be reached by email at peter.doherty, DOHERTYOMI, @gmail.com. God bless, have a great week, and I wish you all a very blessed Christmas.